wiring, everybody's favorite. So now that I got this bumper installed, I have to wire in my fog lights, my spotlights. I also need to wire in my fridge. I'm putting in a ham radio. So I got a lot of wiring to do. Let's jump into it today. I've got a few projects to do with this. One project for the wiring, I've got relays I'm going to add. But first off, I have a distribution block. I'm going to wire this direct to the battery using a 100 amp circuit breaker. I did my math on the lights. These lights are, the fog lights are 40 amp lights each. They're 40 watt lights each. The spotlights are 50 watts each. Now if I have my front spots, the fogs, and if I build a rear bumper with a couple of flush mount spotlights in them, I have all that running, plus my fridge, plus transmitting on my radio, all at the same time, which is very unlikely, I'll be right about 50 amps of power. I think the 100 watt or 100 amp circuit breaker is going to be perfect for that. Let's get it installed. The first problem I have is where I'm going to install this at. I need to install this distribution block somewhere. I'd like to put it somewhere close to the battery, but as you can see, there's not a lot of room in there. I'm thinking I'm going to have to build something off the inner fender somewhere down in here, put it up and bolt it down to the inner fender so I can put the distribution block up high. Otherwise, I'm not too sure where I could put it on this side. I want to have it close to the battery. It's just finding somewhere accessible. A lot of hoses and tubes. If you're like I am, I saw this nice spot right here. It's like, oh, perfect. I can put my distribution block right there. It wouldn't be a big deal at all. Until I decided to put the hood down and it would crunch right into that distribution block. Takes that spot out. The other spot I was thinking is maybe back on the firewall, but that's not really accessible to the battery and to me when I want to wire stuff in. So I think I'm going to try and build something up close to the battery. I changed my mind. I ended up building a little bracket and bolting it onto the radiator support. Works pretty good, nice and solid, not going anywhere. Now I need to find a spot for my relays. What I'm thinking is I could weld it to the back side right here, a little shelf to bolt my relays down to. They look a little bit like this. So what I can do, put a little shelf, bolt those to it, and I have room for all four of them along that shelf. That's coming up next. I think this turned out well. So I've got the relays mounted up there. I have the circuit breaker mounted right up against the front there. I think that's going to work out well. Okay, so I got the bracket all finished up. It's painted, it's installed, and I've started work on the wiring that goes from my circuit breaker to the distribution block. Essentially, it's going to run this one 6-gauge wire from the positive through the circuit breaker and then onto the distribution block. I did look up the specs. 6-gauge wire can handle up to 100 amps, 2.9 feet. And this is obviously not 2.9 feet of wire, so I'm not too concerned about it. And I really don't think I'm ever going to run more than 100 amps through this, especially since it'll do a circuit break if it gets more than 100 amps. So it should be plenty for this application. Today, I'm going to get this switch panel into this kick panel underneath my steering wheel on my Bronco. That's going to go right inside here, just something like that. Okay, so after doing a little bit of measuring, I got my pattern drawn out. It's going to look a little bit like this right here. What I need to do is come out from the cubby hole, drop it down a little bit, over and up to fill the space. With that said, here's my cutout for the switch panel. It angles in a little bit and then goes back. Got my basic shape. cut it out of metal, 22 gauge. With the help of my Harbor Freight brake, I got this bent up. It'll sit right inside of this pocket like this, just like that. And I have the switch panel. I'm going to trim up these edges, make it sit a little more flush, but otherwise it's good to go. It's wired. All wired up, ready to go. Final piece of my wiring project is to wire in a ham radio. These are the parts that I'm going to be putting in. Got my radio, antenna mount, some extra wire, the wiring harness for my radio, and the antenna right here, and the bracket to put in. The radio is a Yaesu FT2900. I love these radios. I have a couple of them. They're a solid piece. They have cooling fins instead of a fan, so in dusty environments they work great. You're not blowing a bunch of dust in on the electronics. Completely sealed. They have 75 watts of transmit power, which is better than most other radios, at least other mobile radios. They are only a 2-meter radio. They're not a dual band, anything like that, but I like it. It works well. So let's get this started. First things first, I got to install the wiring harness. Unfortunately, the wiring harness that comes with the radio is only about 8 feet long. The way I'm going to run it through my Bronco needs probably about 2 more feet than that, 2 or 3 more feet. I have some extra 10 gauge cable that I'm going to use. So as you can see, this is what I've already done. I'm going to run it along this loom that I put in. It runs along the firewall and down, then through a grommet into the cabin. Looking at that, I'm guessing it's probably about 10 to 12 feet to get it to where I need to go. So a quick side note, I wired up my relays wrong. It was my fault. I read the this little schematic wrong. I looked at it and I took blue to the switch, I took white to the battery. Dumb mistake, whatever. What it did was make my relays always on. So these 2 relays were constantly drawing power. It will eventually draw your battery down, but the bigger issue I had, about 10 miles after I installed all this, my transmission started acting up. I'm guessing, and this is only a guess at this point, that the way that I wired it in was backfeeding through the switch panel that I bought, and because of that it was backfeeding and messing up the sensors, messing up the PCM, whatever, and put my transmission into limp mode. As soon as I wired in the relays correctly, transmission started working correctly again. So again, not sure 100%, but bottom line, pay attention to what you're doing when you're wiring. You ever have those projects that should be way easier than what they turn out to be? This was one of them. This should have been a 5-minute install, and yet it took me, I'm into it well over an hour at this point. So I bought this for an antenna mount. It's an NMO mount for an NMO antenna. Looks like this. So antenna sits down like that on here. Your antenna cable comes up through the bottom and screws on. So this was, I believe it was a Midland, I'll put a link in the description. Advertised as a 3/4 inch NMO mount. Like perfect. It's black, aluminum, just what I want for my Bronco. I'm going to mount it on the spare tire carrier. First off, I go to put the antenna cable on, and it doesn't fit through the hole. Even though it was advertised as a 3/4 inch NMO mount, it was a 5/8 inch hole. No problem, it's aluminum. I have a 3/4 inch drill bit. Drilled it out to 3/4. Went to stick this through, and it still didn't fit. Turns out that my antenna cable was a was 13/16. Ended up having to drill that out a little bit more. I ended up using a die grinder on it so I could fit this through. Well then, turns out that this part of it was way too thick. It didn't fit. So when I stuck the mount through, such as this, there weren't enough threads. I don't know if you can see that there are now. There weren't enough threads to grab hold of with the locking ring. So I took my angle grinder and ground it flat, or ground it thinner. So now it's much thinner and this works. Something that should have taken 5 minutes to install, like I said, I'm into it well over an hour at this point. Just one of those days. I followed the previous loom up. There's a couple of 25 amp fuses that go for the radio. Followed along back to the firewall and then down. I went through the grommet for the transmission shifter. Have the ground over here on the fender. Same ground that's there from the factory. Around back, installed the antenna. The mount turned out okay. A little wet out here. Looks good. Followed the spare tire mount, ran the wire underneath the frame, around to the passenger, or to the driver's side rather, up the driver's side, and of course, because nothing's ever easy, I ran out of length for my antenna cable. I had to splice on a couple connectors. Not a big deal. Luckily I had some left over from a previous project. But yeah, turned out good. Guess I could show you inside. Mounted the ham on my center console. Not a lot of options in here.
Lows 30 to 35.
Weather
Light
channel
winds.
works.
Wednesday, partly sunny. Highs 50 to 55.
And that's it. And the rest of my panel. Looks good. There you have it, guys. Wiring is all done, at least for now. Fridge is wired, lights on the bumper are wired, the ham radio is installed and wired. I hope that's it. Wiring's not my favorite, but it is what it is. Got it done. I'm happy with it. Up next, still got a pile of parts to put on. Stick around.